This is a talk that I gave on the 29th of April 2005 at the Oriental Institute in Oxford. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to organise ourselves well enough to make a recording of that talk, but seeing as a few people have asked to have a recording because they couldn't attend, I thought I'd just quickly go through the same material with the same presentation. The talk's about Greek Pyrrhonism, that we know principally through the works of Sextus Empiricus, and the Buddhist philosophy Madhyamaka. Both of these projects, if you like, or systems, orientate themselves towards causing a complete, thorough epistemological collapse. So when I first advertised the talk, someone that I've never met before commented that surely the speaker in this talk should suspend judgment about whether these two projects are the same or different. That's the kind of thing that people make jokes about when they talk about Sextus Empiricus and Pyrrhonism generally, but actually it involves a certain amount of truth in this case. An awful lot of energies being devoted on both sides to try to establish what exactly the Pyrrhonists believed, what exactly Madhyamakas believed, despite the fact that both projects quite strongly, and I think in a sophisticated and effective way, critique that kind of attack, in particular with the idea of the two different kinds of truth, which we're going to talk about later. Even at the time of the Pyrrhonists in ancient Greece, one philosopher called Theodosius, that we don't really know anything about, commented that it didn't make sense for these Pyrrhonists to call themselves Pyrrhonists, because if they really did, as they claimed, undermine the justification for believing in so many different things, they would also obviously have undermined the justification for believing that Pyrrho had a particular mindset. So how could they possibly name themselves after him? I don't think Theodosius meant it as a joke, because he's known to have written quite a lot of treatises on the Pyrrhonists. It's actually quite a cutting point to make, and so eventually what I'll come round to saying is that we need to adopt a very particular approach when we're investigating these two projects, an approach based more on the practical consequences of applying what they applied, rather than trying to second guess what they were actually doing. So it's increasingly recognised, let's say over the last few decades, that ancient Pyrrhonism bears a striking resemblance to Buddhism, and especially to Madhyamaka. Some have actually argued that it's in fact the Greeks' reinvention of Buddhism, transmitted when Pyrrho travelled to India with Alexander the Great to consult with naked sages there. Others have contended that it was, on the contrary, the Greeks who transmitted their doctrines to the Indians, and others yet again vehemently reject the possibility of any such transmission in either direction, principally on grounds of language barriers. We're going to look at the possibilities of transmission later, but first of all I want to deal with a kind of preliminary question, a curiosity. Why is it only now that these parallels have been discovered? once I've addressed that question quickly, I'll make an attempt to introduce the Pyrrhonists. In a talk like this, and like the one that I gave in Oxford, it's a bit difficult to know how to frame the talk, what level to pitch it at. So I've assumed in this talk that the listeners more or less familiar with Madhyamaka and maybe less familiar with Pyrrhonists. Obviously that's not always the case. So I'll introduce the Pyrrhonists, what little we know about them at least, and that's not just for interest's sake. Later on in the talk, when we look at the historical evidence, it will be important to know something about where these people lived. Then I'll introduce the main topics of my research, which are rather more focused on the philosophy itself, or the projects themselves, rather than the historical considerations. So actually, since we have for both Pyrrhonism and Madhyamaka rather detailed and specific self-characterizations from within the traditions, in this very superficial investigation we'll apply the identity criteria crosswise, insofar as we're able, given the time limits, to ask whether the practitioners of these two traditions would recognize each other as undertaking the same enterprise or not, and if not, why. Then we'll explore some of the applications of the deconstructive method in the two projects to see how similar they really are. I'll try to summarize some really quite extensive research that I've done in a few minutes. And then finally we'll consider the historical evidence for and against transmissions of doctrines, I think with some provocative conclusions. Of course we don't have much time, and what I really want to do is not so much go into the details of everything, although I will present some details to give you a kind of taste. But what I'd like to do is give a sense of how much potential there is in studying both these two projects, either independently or in conjunction with each other. So here is a poem celebrating not the Buddha, although it's for anyone familiar with Buddhist texts, it could well be a praise of the Buddha. This is actually a praise of Pyrrho by his student Timon. What might surprise us looking at these philosophers today is that at one stage Pyrrho was as well known as Socrates, and actually was mentioned very much in the same breath as Socrates in the classical sources. Socrates obviously went on to become very famous in the Western tradition, whereas Pyrrho has pretty much sunk into obscurity. We can ask why that is. One reason is probably just how slippery the Pyrrhonists were in terms of being able to identify them. Another reason is Christianity. Here we have Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, describing how the early churches had been, as he put it, infected by Sextuses and Pyrrhos. it seems to have been really quite a problem, at least according to these figures who perhaps wanted to introduce a particular form of dogma, that the antithetic style that Sextus catalogues and that's ascribed to Pyrrho had become a kind of a weapon between the early churches in rivalry with each other. So we can see that the early churches enthusiastically adopted this way of argumentation. But then, of course, in the subsequent history of Christianity, we know that a dogmatic assertion of one particular discourse came to characterize the church. So that's one reason, again, why Pyrrhonism seems to have disappeared. It was embraced in what we might call a suffocating embrace by Christianity, which then overcame it. And it's not just Pyrrhonism, of course, that, historically speaking, became obscure. In the history of India, Buddhism too somehow disappeared. Buddhism, as expressed in India, has been largely unknown in the West until recently. And it's partly due to the spectacular success of the Brahmanical religion, or religions, in a multi-pronged effort to suppress and appropriate Buddhist doctrines. And it's not so much about Islam, although people tend to blame Islam for the decline of Buddhism in India. Travellers in India and Nepal will be familiar with the idea that Hinduism welcomed the Buddha and taught that the Buddha was an avatar of Vishnu. But what they might not realise is that the scriptures which teach this are actually fiercely aggressive against Buddhism as an independent religion. The Buddha avatar being a kind of a trickster, attacking the Vedic religion to separate the chaff, that's to say the Buddhists, from the grain, which is the true Vedic followers, so that the subsequent avatar, Kalki, can cleanly annihilate the former, the Buddhists, in order to restore the pure Vedic religion of the latter. Meanwhile, Vishnu's consort, Lakshmi, sends herself forth as the avatar in the form of a Buddhist nun to have sex with all the four castes and pollute everyone in what constitutes a deliciously politically astute defamation of the Buddha's acceptance of all the castes on the spiritual path. So the famous story of the destruction of Nalanda and Vikramashila aside, Islam really just mopped up the miserable remnants of Buddhism after Brahmanism's sustained and thorough assault. Biruni, the main scholar under the Mahmud of Ghazna, who's usually accredited with the destruction of many Buddhist institutions across North India, Biruni failed. He was interested to meet Buddhists, but he failed to find any more Buddhists left to talk to. And even the doctrines that he was told were Buddhist, we can now recognise as belonging to particular non-Buddhist schools. So he was duped. Pyrrhonism in the West has become better known again since the discovery of Sextus Empiricus' works in Greek manuscript, and especially since an influential Latin translation, or translations made in 1562 and 1569, and the publication of the Greek texts in 1621. Sextus is recognised to have deeply influenced Montaigne, Hume, Hegel, Descartes, Pascal and many others. However, it's been consistently and almost irremediably misunderstood. Because of what these philosophers have done with Pyrrhonism, by which I mean principally the use of the word skeptic to mean what it now means, someone who has a stake in not believing dogmas, and in particular religious dogmas. That's to say, a kind of Cartesian doubt. Because the Pyrrhonists called themselves skeptikoi, this has led to a great deal of misrepresentation of their project, called skepsis, and in fact meaning thorough inspection. Nowhere in the entire corpus of Pyrrhonist texts is the word doubt used, much less advocated. What is advocated is the conceptual analysis of beliefs until one reaches the point or comes to be at a loss to conceptualize them logically or to match them with experience. That state of being at a loss, what's called in Greek aporia, means literally no passing point. It's cognate to the Sanskrit word aparam. A great deal of difficulty of interpretation was introduced by the central translations into English of Sextus's work by the Reverend Berry, translating this word aporia as confusion, which is completely wrong, or more frequently doubt, implying two vacillating positions and the inability to choose between them, which, while it has some truth, as we shall see, touches on one of the most controversial difficulties with Pyrrhonism, one which Madhyamaka may clarify once and for all. As for Madhyamaka, it's only in the last few years that understanding of this very tricky suite of doctrines is reaching maturity. So here are possibly the most important works that have been done so far on the parallels between Pyrrhonism and Madhyamaka. Machiavelli's work is not just on those two projects, it's a monumental and very uneven consideration of the entirety of Greek and Indian thought and possible connections between them. His chapter on Pyrrhonism and Madhyamaka has some really remarkable parallels, but it's done very unsystematically. And he also is not that familiar with the Buddhist tradition, so he has a tendency to anachronistically use Buddhist teachings from much later than the period of Pyrrhonism, implying that there were no Buddhist doctrines in that form earlier than that, whereas in fact someone familiar with Buddhism can often identify much earlier texts which have the same doctrine. And because even if it doesn't imply that he means that there were no Buddhist precedents for those later doctrines, he unfortunately creates the atmosphere of being someone who's not familiar enough with the Buddhist tradition, so it becomes somehow a much less convincing argument about the parallels. Kuzminski's book is obviously entirely focused on Pyrrhonism. He doesn't talk a great deal about Madhyamaka. He's considering parallels with Buddhism as a whole, and it's quite a short monograph, and again not really very systematic, but it nevertheless full of really fascinating connections. McEverley argues that there was a transmission, he thinks, from the Greeks to the Indians, and Kuzminski refutes that and argues for a transmission from the Indians to the Greeks. This year, actually, Christopher Beckwith is going to publish this book, Greek Buddha. It hasn't come out yet, it's coming out in July, I think, where he considers the history of Pyrrho and his travels in India with Alexander the Great. So I look forward to seeing what he says about that. He is mainly a historian, but I've heard that he will consider the doctrines of what's considered to be early Buddhism, and how it might relate to Pyrrhonist doctrines. So, just to introduce the Pyrrhonists, who were they? We have some information about Pyrrho's teachers. Both Diogenes Laertius and Sextus Empiricus tell us that the Pyrrhonists call themselves Pyrrhonists because they recognised that among their antecedents, Pyrrho most closely embodied their project. So let's look, naturally enough, at Pyrrho first of all. The parts of the lineage shown here in italics are the ones that are derived from a Byzantine encyclopedia called the Fortress, which, it's important to note, was written centuries later and is very uneven in its accuracy. The other figures in the lineage not in italics are from Diogenes Laertius, and Diogenes Laertius also is not really considered to be firmly reliable. It's more like a kind of scandalous dirty secrets of the ancient philosophers, but it nevertheless he does have quite a detailed treatment of Pyrrho, and even, according to one reading of the Greek, suggests that he himself is a Pyrrhonist. So presumably knows with some accuracy about the people and the doctrines. Whether Pyrrho did gain or impart anything in India, or rather what's now Afghanistan and Pakistan, since Alexander never actually entered what is now called India, it's a very contested point, with some scholars, notably Richard Bett, denying both possibilities. This is what Diogenes says. Notice that he says Pyrrho foregathered with Indian naked sages and with magi. We shouldn't make too much about the expression naked, given that the word gymnosophistae, it was used really quite generally, including for Egyptian priests who we know were not entirely naked. There's also some lines in Greek histories which mention naked sages who wore loincloths, for example. So we needn't get so concerned about the word naked as to try to ascribe these accounts to encounters with Jains, for example. The sages in question needn't be entirely naked. People who are familiar with Madhyamaka, incidentally, might feel their hackles raising reading the last few lines of this excerpt. Let's look at the subsequent transmission of these doctrines, again according to Diogenes. This is how we get from Pyrrho to Sextus Empiricus, who's the main redactor of Pyrrhonist doctrines in the texts that have come down to us. Unfortunately, most of these people really are little more than names and places. The first thing really is to notice where they lived, and we can see that, broadly speaking, the lineage begins in what's now Greece, specifically in Elis, which we can see on this map, and works its way clockwise around the Mediterranean through what's now Syria and into Egypt and what's now Libya. Incidentally, the supposed antecedents of Pyrrho's teaching in Greece were mainly from Megara, which is at the northeast of this peninsula. So, among Pyrrho's main students, those of whom we know at least, most of them were from what's now Greece, such as Timon. Some of them were from what's now in Turkey, such as Hecataeus and Nausiphanes. Both of them spent time in Teos. This is the Senate in Teos, which you can visit. It's near the tiny port town of Selçuk, now in western Anatolia. The ruins of Teos are really quite extensive, but they're scattered across quite a wide area of olive groves. Hecataeus also spent time in Abdera, which is near the border between Greece and Turkey. Nausiphanes is supposed to have written treatises on Pyrrhonism, but they've all been lost. And Hecataeus is known to us also from his travelogue of Egypt, and as the describer of Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind, which is sometimes identified as the British Isles. The fortress mentions a student of Pyrrho called Theodorus of Cyrene, which is now in northeast Libya. But the intention may be that he was a later follower of Pyrrho's doctrines, not necessarily a direct student, in which case he would fit later into our arc of transmission. One of Timon's students, Pyrrhus of the Troad, Pyrrhus being a form of Paul, is probably the same one that's mentioned by a contemporary bishop as having displayed extraordinary indifference to legal injustices that led to his execution. I took this picture at Alexandria, Troas, his town, which is near the location of ancient Troy. Unfortunately, Diogenes' sources did not, it seems, deal with the other branches of the transmission than the principal one, which I've shown in bold font on the main lineage. So, according to the lineage that he's focused on, we have a transmission from Pyrrho to Timon, and then from Timon to Euphranor of Seleucia. One of Diogenes' sources says that the lineage died out with Timon and wasn't revived until later by Ptolemy of Cyrene. But the other of his sources mentions this Euphranor of Seleucia as a student of Timon, Seleucia was a vast kingdom, stretching, as you can see, as far as the Indian border, although it's likely that Euphranor was from the area around the Tigris, now in Iraq. He in turn taught Eubulus of Alexandria in Egypt, who in turn taught Ptolemy of Cyrene. Here's the ruins of Cyrene, which you can now visit in northeast Libya. According to Diogenes, Ptolemy taught someone called Heraclides, about whom we know nothing, except that he taught the next major figure in Pyrrhonist history, Anisidormus of Knossos, or Aegae. Although he was originally from Knossos, he spent a lot of time at Alexandria in Egypt, and indeed he was the head of the academy there. This quote is from a work called Preparation for the Gospel by Bishop Eusebius, and here he's quoting a very Pyrrhonist hostile philosopher, a peripatetic called Aristocles of Messene. Notice that it mentions that it was just yesterday that Anisidormus stirred up this nonsense again. So this is one way that the dates of Anisidormus can be located with some firmness. Anisidormus, after Sextus, is the most voluminous Pyrrhonist source, except perhaps Diogenes himself. Anisidormus's works are summarised unsympathetically in a work by Bishop Photius of Constantinople, who lived in the 9th century of the Common Era, and who's a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church but anathematized in the Catholic Church. His famous library is basically his own summaries of the works in his own library, and out of 280 summaries, volume 212 is the summary of Anisidormus's skeptical or Pyrrhonist treatises. We don't know anything about Anisidormus's student, except that he lived in the same place, or his student in turn, except that he was lame, literally twisted-footed. But his student in turn, Antiochus, was based in Laodicea, which you can see here. Laodicea is a surprisingly well-preserved city, now in the area of Denizli in Anatolia. Here you can see the main forum under reconstruction when I visited in 2014. There are also 2 large amphitheatres there, and most of the roadways of the main city are still there. His student was Manadotus of Nicomedia, about whom again we know almost nothing except some comments by Galen, the physician. Here we can see that he characterises Manadotus in a way which is recognisably Pyrrhonist, drawing attention to tenets being contradictory to each other and contradictory to phenomena, and being severe against dogmatists or people who assert fixed beliefs about the way things are. It's interesting to note that both Menedotus and his student Herodotus of Tarsus are physicians like Sextus. Also, he's a physician. So the last three members of this Pyrrhonist lineage are all medical physicians. So finally we get to Herodotus's student Sextus Empiricus, and although he is by far the most voluminous source for Pyrrhonist doctrines, and not to mention a whole suite of other Hellenistic philosophers, including the Stoics, we know possibly the least about him as a person. We're not even sure where he lived. And very quickly histories seem to have become confused. I think it's an interesting question why those histories would become so quickly confused. We know of various Sextuses, and there's scholarly contention about all of them, even before we wonder whether they might be the same person. From the same Byzantine encyclopedia, the Fortress, we have references to these three Sextuses. The first one, Sextus of Cheironea, is interesting. Cheironea is in Boeotia, in mainland Greece. It mentions that he was a favourite of Marcus Aurelius, and that he adhered to the teachings of Pyrrho, and wrote books about inspection, the Episkeptica. This is what Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, said about that Sextus, which may or may not be Sextus Empiricus. Never displaying a sign of anger nor any kind of emotion, at once entirely imperturbable and yet full of kindly affection. The argument against that Sextus being Sextus Empiricus is usually based on the Augustan histories, which mention this Sextus in a list of the Emperor Marcus's philosophy tutors, and at the end of the list it says that they were all Stoics, or rather it says that they were Stoics. In the standard English translation, the word all has been added without any basis in the Latin. Furthermore, the authenticity of the Augustan histories has now pretty much been undermined. They seem to be a forgery done about 600 years ago, so they're not a strong source. But nevertheless, that's the main argument that's usually put against Sextus of Cheironea being the same as Sextus Empiricus. The Fortress also mentions these other two Sextuses, both from Libya, perhaps the same person. Again, it's difficult to know. The first one, as you can see, known to have written these 10 books on the Skeptica again. The second one has been appropriated by Christianity. The Christians claimed that this Africanus was the same Africanus who wrote Christian texts, but these texts mentioned in the Fortress, the charmed girdles, are certainly not Christian, much more magical, occult than Christian. And it's interesting that this Africanus also wrote medical treatises, so was presumably a practicing physician. But we can't really say much more than that. We certainly can't make any firm declarations either way that these Sextuses were the same as Sextus Empiricus or different. here are the complete works of Sextus Empiricus as available in the Loeb Classical Library. So we have outlines of Pyrrhonism, which is divided into parts. The first part is a kind of general consideration of what Pyrrhonists do, and then there are then sections dealing specifically with logical beliefs, by which I mean beliefs about epistemology and logic, physical beliefs and ethical beliefs. Then aside from that, there are more expansive treatises on those specific areas. One treatise against logicians, which again is about epistemology and logic, and one treatise against the physicists and one against the ethicists. Usually those treatises read like an elaboration on the same material in outlines, almost as though their outlines is a root text, and these are the commentaries on it. Sometimes, however, you find more sophisticated arguments in outlines and more simplistic or cruder arguments in the larger treatises. And then finally there's a group of much smaller treatises which gets lumped together as against the professors on particular disciplines such as music and astronomy, which I think are somehow less persuasive and less dazzling. Outlines and the three large treatises, I can't recommend them enough. I would say if you're new to Pyrrhonism, avoid the secondary literature on Pyrrhonism and go straight to Sextus Empiricus and read exactly what Sextus has said. There's nothing quite like it. It is an astonishing feat. Each of these texts outlines against logicians, against physicists and against ethicists. They've all been retranslated more recently. The advantage of having the Loeb edition is that you have the Greek, and I think it's crucial really to go to the Greek to make sure that you're not becoming the slave of distortions introduced by various translators. I've already mentioned how distorting Berry's translation, for example, of aporia was. I think there are also problems with the more recent translations, and I think it's even if you do prefer the modern translations, it's crucial to have access to the original Greek texts. So now let's turn to the main part of what my research has involved for the last few years. As I said, I'll divide it into two parts: the criteria by which these projects identify themselves first, and then some specific applications of their deconstructive method. So first of all, the self-identification criteria. These are expressed pretty succinctly in the opening of Outlines of Pyrrhonism in the first book on the so-called general method of Pyrrhonism. So I've arranged these in a kind of Mahayana doxographical way as the basis, the way, and the result, or the ground, the path, and the fruition, as it's sometimes put. And I'm going to give you a taste of some excerpts from the two projects, and we can play a kind of a game. At first I won't identify which project each quote came from, and you can try to guess whether you think it's Madhyamaka or Pyrrhonist. So first of all, we have this quote about the nature of the language, that the things which are said are not said in order to affirm that this is the way things are, but they're a kind of narration about phenomena being experienced by the speaker at that moment. All that is actually from Sextus's outlines. I think it's something that's often overlooked in the secondary literature, that Sextus says this about absolutely everything that he says in his entire treatise. And here we have a similar quote. Again, a private law of phenomena, and something which is narrated, in this case for the sake of instruction. It's not an issue to be voiced, which is to say, in this case, it's not something which is supposed to become a subject for discussion and debating. That's actually from Nagarjuna, from his Ratnavali and the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. This word yautikam, it can be translated just as special. Some support for translating it as private comes from the canonical praises of the Dharma in all Buddhist schools. Actually, the last excellence of the Dharma of the list is that it can only be seen directly in one's own experience by the wise. It's not something which is transmissible in words. So here we have self-characterization of not affirming or denying anything. It's actually from Sextus Empiricus again. And there we have the Greek term for this non-assertion, the technical term aphasian. So that was the basis. Now if we turn to the way or the path, these formulations of the basis and the way and the results come from later Madhyamaka literature, of course, but they do give us a good way of organising the material. The way is taught to be the unity of the two accumulations, merit and insight. Merit is the ways of accumulating merit aren't taught to be something special to the Buddha Dharma, but the accumulation of insight is taught to be something unique to the Buddha Dharma. So we'll focus on the accumulation of insight. That in the Buddhist system is done by vipassana, meditation. Vipassana actually means thorough inspection, and it comes from the root pasya, meaning seeing. In older Vedic language, it wasn't spash, but spash. And when we realised that the sh consonant is closely connected to the ksh consonant, then we can see the connection between spash, which could be spaksh, and the Latinate words with spect, such as inspection, the word that I've chosen to translate these in English. although the Latinate words have spec, the Greek has skep, and that inversion of the two consonants k and p is quite common in etymological development. It's called metathesis. So we see that the word skepsis, which Sextus uses to characterize his own project, is actually cognate with the word which was used in later Buddhism to describe what the Madhyamakas were doing, vipassana, this inspection of the elements of reality. The verb of skepsis is skeptomai, to inspect. One interesting thing is that the cognate of the Sanskrit prefix v, in which is related to the number 2, in Greek is dia, and that actually we find the verb skeptomai used with that prefix dia, as dia skeptomai, when describing the Pyrrhonists in the earlier literature, earlier than Sextus Empiricus, I mean. So, for example, Aristocles of Messene uses this verb dia skeptomai to talk about what the Pyrrhonists are doing. So we don't just have a cognate in the roots, we have a cognate in even the prefix applied to the root. So what is the practice of inspection? Here we have a quote describing what thorough inspection involves. The object is to be thoroughly discerned, thoroughly sifted, reckoned up, and observed from every angle. With proper analysis, observe and master it. That's the definition of vipassana in the Arya Sandhya Sutra. This sutra is associated with not the Madhyamaka but with the other main kind of Mahayana, the Yogacara. Nevertheless, it gives us a good idea about what Buddhists meant when they used the word vipassana in the Mahayana context. And here we have a description of what inspectiveness is all about. Notice it mentions it's an ability. In the same way that the Buddhist texts described it as a skill. So it's not a creed, it's not something that you have to believe in. And again, this is an issue where the secondary literature sometimes wanders very far from what Sextus actually says, in its concern to try to establish what doctrines the Pyrrhonists held. It isn't a suite of doctrines, so it's important to keep that in mind. We're not talking about a suite of doctrines that can either be described as Pyrrhonist or not. What we're describing is an ability. The ability might involve the use of doctrines, especially, obviously, the use of doctrines against each other, or against phenomena. But just because Sextus, or for that matter, the Madhyamikas, just because they apparently are asserting a particular doctrine, it doesn't mean that they think that that doctrine is something which characterises themselves. And we're going to talk about this, what we might call mirror language, using the language of the interlocutor a bit later on. So that's actually from Outlines. that description of what inspectiveness is about is quite different to anything that I know of in the Madhyamaka literature. But nevertheless, it does describe quite well what Nagarjuna, for example, is doing. Nagarjuna himself doesn't say that he's doing vipassana, but he does use words like vichara, which means analysis, and vimarsha, which means working things out, and pratyeksa, the same words that was used in the sutra, meaning looking into something or inspecting, scrutinizing something. Notice that Sextus's description of inspectiveness, in that description he says that it leads first to suspension and then to untroubledness. The word suspension, epoche, in the Greek, sometimes gets translated as suspension of judgment. It's literally, the word itself seems to come from a root meaning holding back or withdrawing. Sextus uses it to describe what happens to our tendency to want to believe things when we're brought to aporia, this being at a loss as to how to make a decision about the way things are. Notice that he says that first there's suspension and then untroubledness, ataraxia. We could call this a freedom from trouble as well. The word taraxia seems to be quite closely related to a suite of words in Sanskrit related to trouble and affliction, including possibly the usual word for afflictive emotion in the Buddhist teachings, klesha. Klesha seems to be related to taraxia. So Sextus talks about anomalies leading us to be at a loss in this way, and so does Nagarjuna in a way. He says that some things are just not found in experience and some things are not logically sound. Navidyate, nayujate. Those two classes of anomaly, they're also referred to by Sextus. He talks about contradictions with experienced phenomena and concepts. The words in the Greek are quite important to know here. So what I've translated as experienced phenomena, in the Greek it's phenomena, and what I've translated as concepts is noumena. So we've got phenomena and noumena. Notice that he also talks about how they can be in conflict with each other. So one way that this being at a loss is expressed is to point out that we're unable to say that this is the way things are or that is the way things are. That quote is actually from Nagarjuna, from the Yukti Shastika. Notice that he uses the word upalabhyate, the negative, nupalabhyate, not attained. That might ring a bell if we cast our minds back to the first description of Pyrrho's doctrine as supposedly learned from the Indians, according to Diogenes. He mentions this unattainedness. And again, the inability to say about reality that it's any more this way than it is that way. The word in Greek for unattainedness, akatalepsias, interestingly, again, is cognate with the Sanskrit word which Nagarjuna used, upalabhyate. So the root labya means reaching or attaining, and the past participle is labda, which is like lepta in Greek, akatalepta, unattained. So again, we have this cognateness between the technical terms used by the two projects. One thing that people often say about Pyrrhonism as distinct from supposed Eastern traditions is that Pyrrhos was certainly less religious, for example, insofar as the fact that he didn't, for example, meditate. But actually in Diogenes there's a reference, as we can see here, to Pyrrho withdrawing from the world and living in solitude. And the word in the Greek for this, erimadzein, is the same root as the English word hermit, or eremitical life. It literally means belonging to the desert, or a deserted area, an area with no people. Notice that when Diogenes mentions it, it's in reference to this story about an Indian reproaching Pyrrho's philosopher companion Anaxarchus. Anaxarchus is a bit famous for fawning on kings. The Indian reproached him, saying that how can you teach others what's good when you're just kowtowing to these worldly rulers. Pyrrho heard that chastisement, and according to Diogenes, in what's probably a rather superficial and sensationalist way of putting it, according to just hearing that, Pyrrho went off to withdraw from the world. About the insight, the development of insight still, here we have a quote saying that fixed beliefs aren't construed. That's actually from Sextus, talking about the Pyrrhonists or the inspectives. And then here we have a quote about the abandonment of all fixed beliefs, which is from Nagarjuna. Intriguing thing here, again, is the way that the language is characterized, the language of these projects. So here we have someone saying that although believers, when they talk about something, they are, as they think, enunciating the way things actually are. When we speak, we're not actually saying that this is the way things are, because our own speech cancels itself as well. That's actually from Sextus Empiricus. People who are familiar with Nagarjuna's treatises on epistemology and logic, the Vigraha Vyavartani and the Vedalya Prakarana, will recognise a very vivid similarity with what Nagarjuna says about his own language in those treatises. This idea of cancelling itself is then given the simile of a purgative drug, as we can see in this quotation. This, in fact, is from Sextus Empiricus, again, from the outlines. It's remarkable that he uses the simile of the purgative because, of course, it's one of the famous similes used by Nagarjuna here in the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. Other similes which are used for this language within the project are stairs or steps and fire. Stairs, as we can see here, because you have to step on the stairs to get up to a position of insight or understanding, and fire insofar as the afflictions or the troubles are burnt away by this insight. So in the same way that fire burns away fuel, this insight destroys the net of conceptualizations of reality. This particular citation is from the Madhyamaka Bhava Viveka. It's quite remarkable that those two similes are brought together there, because as we see here in this excerpt we have all three similes used together. The fire, again, destroying itself as the fuel is destroyed, in the same way that the conceptualizations destroy each other and themselves, and the purgative, because of the self-cancelling aspect, and the ladder which you climb. Even though you can kick away the ladder once you're up, you still need it to get up there. So it's something which is used temporarily. So we have all of the three similes brought together, and here this is actually in Sextus Empiricus. So we have a kind of remarkable similarity in the use of similes to describe the language which is deployed in the two projects, particularly as we've seen in Bhava Viveka. So the result of the path is taught in the later Madhyamaka literature to be the two embodiments in union, the two kayas in union, which is to say the aspects of awakening to understanding. One kaya is the kaya or the embodiment which brings benefit to oneself, which is the actual realization of the nature of reality, or the dharma kaya. And then the other embodiment or kaya is the one by which one becomes of benefit to others, to other sentient beings. The rupa kaya, or the form body, which is then subdivided into the sambhoga kaya and the nirmana kaya. So we can have a look to see if Pyrrhonism refers to anything similar like that. So first of all, the kaya which is of benefit to others. Here we have a quote talking about curing the conceit and rashness of belief mongers in the same way that physicians would cure bodily ailments. And the motivation is taught to be love for humanity. It's actually from Sextus Empiricus. This simile of spiritual understanding and sharing spiritual understanding as being like the operations of a physician. It's actually quite a common idea. It's not just Pyrrhonism which had it in the Greek schools. Epicureanism was possibly the first school that used that simile. Here we have the Madhyamikas using it. Chandrakirti in his Prasannapada. They here is referring obviously to the awakened ones, the Buddhas, those who've reached the complete understanding. And again, the Madhyamikas would stress that all of this activity is based on the principal object, which is concerned to help others. As you can see here in the Prasannapada again. And then in terms of the Dharmakaya, or the embodiment for one's own benefit, a kind of freedom from circumstances, domination. Here we have a description of the end, freedom from disturbance, about objects of belief, and about necessities, a middle state. That's actually Sextus Empiricus. And the middle state, metriopathein, is a word that Sextus doesn't really explain very much. I think there's plenty to be gained from looking into this, especially given in the Madhyamaka side the controversy about whether people training in first of all in the analysis of conceptualizations about reality, and then once there's been gained a direct vision of reality, training, familiarizing oneself in that state, whether people at various levels along that path can experience, for example, physical pain. There's a very large literature obviously about that and the controversy about it. It would be interesting to compare that to what Sextus says about the result for one's own side of his project, if one engages in it, which is, as he says, a kind of freedom from disturbance, but not a total freedom from disturbance. And he actually gives the example of a surgical operation. He says that some people will, when they're looking at surgery, will faint because of their own conceptualizations, leading to fear, nausea. He says that we can get rid of that, the kind of extra suffering that comes from our own conceptualizations about pain, even if we can't get rid of pain itself. So now turning to specific examples of the deconstructions. What I've done here again is take a later Madhyamaka classification of the different methods of deconstruction used, the 5 great arguments of the Madhyamaka. Although it is later than the period that we're looking at, it does give us a way of summarizing pretty much all of the Madhyamaka argumentation into a kind of 5-fold classification. So just for succinctness in this talk, I've just considered these 5 great arguments. Later on, I'll give you an idea of the collated results of the entire enterprise of Sextus, which involves thousands of arguments. But here I'll just give you a taste of these 5 kinds of deconstruction. So the first of the 5 great arguments, is the Vajra splinters, which is that a phenomena can't come from itself or something else, or a combination of itself and something else, or something other than those possibilities. Here we have a partial example of the Vajra splinters. It's just one example. There are other examples. So if there is a cause of something, it's either the cause of itself or caused by itself rather, or a cause in combination with something else. And here we have a refutation of those 2 possibilities. And if the cause is not productive of anything, either by itself or in conjunction, then it's productive of nothing. That's actually from Sextus Empiricus and against the physicists. It's not a complete Vajra splinter argument, but there are plenty of other examples, and when we take them together we can see that the Vajra splinters was an argument form that Sextus used quite a lot, especially in the physical treatise. The second of the great arguments is the refutation of existent and non-existent results. And here's an example of it. The existent doesn't come into being because it's already there, and the non-existent doesn't come into being because there's nothing to come into being. That's the basic form of that argument. In Madhyamaka, that's called the refutation of existent and non-existent results, and it's found in Sextus again many times. Here, for example, in Against the Physicists. The third argument is the freedom from singularity and plurality. Which boils down to 1 being impossible, and therefore plural numbers being the plural of 1 being impossible. Here we have an example of it. The number 1 can be applied to lots of different things, so this refutation is based on the absurdity of the 1 either being by itself and not partaking of those things, or partaking of them and therefore being divided up, and therefore not 1. And then on the basis of that 1 not existing, then the other numbers not existing, seeing as the same argument can be applied to those plural numbers as can be applied to the single number. That's actually from Sextus Empiricus as well, which Sextus has very, very elaborate deconstructions of the idea of number, focused particularly on the beliefs of the Pythagoreans, a lot of which are now what we consider to be common sense when it comes to mathematics. And then the fourth of the great arguments of the Madhyamaka is the refutation of the 4 alternatives for production, the Chatuskoti. And here is an example. There are complete examples. I've chosen a more complex and partial example to show you here for a reason. So here we've got the impossibility of something coming into being either from an existent thing or a non-existent thing. The complete argument would also say the impossibility from both and from neither. And then in the second part of the argument, the impossibility of something coming into being either from one thing or from several things. And again, the complete argument would add the impossibility of coming from both and from neither. There are examples of the complete arguments. The reason I've given you this particular example is the quite astonishing fact that those two forms of the Catuskoti are exactly the two forms which are taught in the fourth great argument of the Madhyamaka. This particular argument, the refutation of the four alternatives, is presented as existing in two different forms. One is based on existence or non-existence, and one is based on singularity and plurality. And here we have both of those kinds used in the same argument in Sextus Empiricus, against the physicists. It's worth pointing out, I think, about the Catuskoti that one of the central arguments of Richard Bett against the transmission hypothesis relates to this. It has been asserted in the earlier literature that the fourfold argument is very unusual, and it's a striking similarity between Sextus and the Buddhist texts. Bett refutes that by saying that the use of the fourfold argument in the Buddhist texts is different, more restricted. He's using examples from the earlier literature which are only referring to Hinayana texts, in particular the famous unanswered questions of the Buddha, which admittedly are about quite specific doctrines, for example, whether or not the Buddha continues to exist after he dies. What Bett says is that the fourfold argument in Buddhism isn't applied to phenomena in general in the way that it is in Sextus. But of course Bett clearly isn't familiar with the Madhyamaka texts, some of which are also very early, where the fourfold argument certainly is, as we can see, used against all phenomena, not just particular doctrines. So that part of his argument fails with more familiarity with the development of Buddhist doctrine. And the fifth great argument of the Madhyamaka, the most important one probably we can say, is interdependent co-production, pratitya samutpada. And if we look at this quote, all things are in relation to something else or with reference to something else, such that what they are in themselves we don't say. And when we say that these things are in relation to each other, we're talking about appearances, not about. We're not making assertions about the nature of things as they exist in reality, but we're just talking about the appearances, the experienced phenomena. That's very close indeed to the expression of pratitya samutpada in the Mahayana texts. It's actually from Sextus Empiricus again. The famous 10 modes of Pyrrhonism are all really about this interrelatedness. is a subtle difference in tone, as you can see, between the Madhyamakas and Sextus on this issue of interrelation, insofar as whereas the Madhyamakas might well boldly say that rather than there being independent nature or self-existence of phenomena, swabhava, there is aswabhava, that things, that there is a freedom from there being an independent nature. Sextus in a way seems a bit more cagey insofar as he says we can't say as anything about the way things are independently in their own nature. We suspend, we hold off from committing ourselves like that. Probably these two ways of expressing things boil down to the same thing, but it's interesting that there's a difference in emphasis, I think. Obviously this relates quite directly to the Madhyamaka idea of the two kinds of negation, a negation involving implicitly a replacement of what's being negated with something else, or on the other hand a negation which is just a flat denial of a particular case without implying its replacement with something else. That obviously has led to a vast literature of contention in the Indo-Tibetan tradition. I think it would be revelatory to apply the discussion of that to the study of Pyrrhonism. So here are the collated results. I went through all of outlines and all of against logicians, against physicists and against ethicists. For every single argument that Sextus presents, I looked for a parallel argument in the Madhyamaka, and if not in Madhyamaka, in more general Buddhism. I don't have time to go into the kind of criteria that I used to be able to identify a single argument and count the arguments. Obviously there are different ways to divide up arguments, and in fact in this table the way I've divided up the general self-characterizations is very crude indeed. There are finer ways of dividing up the arguments, and if anything they're even more convincing in terms of how many of the arguments then appear to be the same, exactly the same, how many of them appear to be similar. The unshared arguments here, by which I mean the arguments which Sextus uses which I, as far as I know, don't occur in Madhyamaka. We can see that in all the cases the unshared arguments are the least common. Also, what's hidden behind the numbers actually is that the unshared arguments that Sextus uses are usually directed to particular Greek schools, such as the Epicureans or the Stoics, which probably explains why they're not found in Madhyamaka, given that Madhyamakas didn't have to deal with Epicureans and Stoics, who sometimes have really quite, let's say, eccentric dogmatic beliefs about reality, which are not really found in any of the Indian schools that Nagarjuna or Aryadeva had to deal with. So moving on to the question of the historical connections between the two projects. This is a very, very contentious issue. Almost inevitably in a study like this you end up treading on people's toes, really. It's a requirement really to be an expert in a great number of different traditions, and the history of those traditions and the subtleties of thought in those traditions. And I certainly don't claim to be an expert in any of these traditions, but I do think there are some things we can say about the kind of claims which have been made either for or against, given even quite a superficial examination of the historical evidence, such as I have done. So the first issue is what actually happened when Pyrrho went to India with Alexander. And what we have in the modern literature now is a kind of consensus that there couldn't have been a transmission of doctrines. The most famous exponent of this view is Richard Bett, whose main argument is that the language barrier would have prevented any effective philosophical teaching. So let's have a look at that idea. First thing to notice about his theory is that it's an argument made extrapolating from a single case mentioned in the histories. So we have in Strabo this account of the philosopher Onesicritus, who is also one of Alexander's entourage, and in Taxila, a city which is now in Pakistan, or just outside Taxila, Onesicritus meets the Indian naked sage Mandanis, and Onesicritus himself reports that Mandanis refused to teach Onesicritus. Why? Because he said, giving you the benefits of my insights, my wisdom, through these three interpreters would be like passing clear water through mud. Interestingly, Bett accidentally transposes that protest into Onesicritus's mouth. It's not actually Onesicritus who protested that, it was the Indian Mandanis who said that. The first thing that struck me when I read that was it's exactly what Indian gurus typically say to people requesting instruction. There's no point, go away, I'm not a teacher, you're not a suitable disciple. It's a very standard way of testing the intention of the purity of the intention of the potential student, not necessarily a real judgment that Mandanis is making on the quality of the translators. Also, it's kind of assumed that the translators are in a chain, but that needn't necessarily be the case. There were several languages washing around in this area at this time, and it could be that the translators weren't operating in a chain. They could be trying to translate directly into particular languages. Obviously, the argument based on the language barrier depends on asserting that in this area at this time, knowledge of Greek and whatever language the Indians were using wasn't found in particular people, or at least not sophisticated knowledge of the two languages. But that frankly wasn't the case. We know from Alexander's the history of Alexander's expeditions in this area that there were at least two communities encountered who were bilingual, Greek and another language. The Branchidae, who were exiles resettled by Cyrus the Great in the area between Balkh and Samarkand, and the people of Nysa. These were both communities that Alexander encountered. It's not a happy story. I recommend that if you think that Alexander truly is great, I recommend you have a look at this story to revise your opinion. The place where Secretus is supposed to have met Mandanus, and a place where Alexander's entourage stayed for some months, is Taxila, this city in the northwest of India, now in Pakistan. Taxila's very famous in the early Buddhist texts, for example in the Jatakas, as a place of learning, not just for people from India but also from people from the Persian Empire. It was part of the Achaemenid Empire, and Aramaic was used there formally. It's very likely that there were members of Alexander's entourage who spoke Greek and Aramaic fluently. In terms of Sanskrit culture, we have Panini's grammar, which refers to Yavanani, which a commentary interprets as meaning Yavanani, Yavana Lipyam, literally the writing system of the Yonas, which at this stage almost certainly applied to Greeks. Unfortunately, the commentary which glosses Yavanani, which is just the feminine adjective for Greek, as Greek writing, the commentary is later than the Mauryan period, which is what we're considering. So it's possible that the original grammar, which is pre-Mauryan, is referring to Greek ladies rather than language, rather than the writing system. But nevertheless, there's a chance that the Greek writing system was known to the Sanskrit culture, and that's why it was mentioned in Panini's grammar. We don't know how long Pyrrho stayed in Taxila or in any of the places that they passed through. We don't know when Pyrrho went back to Greece, but we do know that there were other philosophers around from Greece in that region. So, for example, in the nearby city of Ai-Khanum, which is probably Alexandria on the Oxus, there's an inscription by a student of Aristotle called Clearchus in Greek, and obviously we know that Anaxarchus was there as a companion of Pyrrho. It's also mentioned in passing in Arian that one of Alexander's bodyguards, Lysimachus, studied, among others, studied with with the Indian sage Calanus. Calanus was a bit notorious. He was one of the Indians who was considered by the Indian teachers to be a very bad student, but he became very popular with the Greeks, partly because he was so fond of partying with the Greeks, it seems. I think it's interesting that that remark in Arian hasn't really been picked up by anybody. It does seem that there was quite extensive instruction going on of a group of Greeks by Indians, as I say, including this bodyguard. Arian doesn't say what was being taught. That's just considering the time of Pyrrho. It's worth bearing in mind that we're not just considering Pyrrho, and in fact Pyrrho is quite a shadowy figure. the people that we're mainly interested in when we talk about Pyrrhonism are later figures, in particular Anisodemus and Sextus, obviously, who are later. And in that period between Pyrrho and Sextus, who's a contemporary of Nagarjuna, incidentally, we can consider the connections between the Indian and Greek culture. And there were a lot in this period, really, to try to argue that there was no transmission of culture between these two. It would require quite a feat of denial of reality, I think. First of all, there were a lot of Greek states in that northwest area of India. Ashoka famously sent Dharma missionaries, or Mahamatras, the great officials, to areas of Bactrian Greeks. So, for example, the Rock Edict number 5 says that Ashoka's Dharma is thriving thanks to the Mahamatras working among the Greeks, the Kambodjas and the Gandharas. Those areas, Cambodia and Gandhara, are also the northwest area, and other people of the west. In terms of the Dharma emissaries, we know even from Pali sources. So, for example, in the Pali sources, the Greek Dhammarakkhita is mentioned, and he was sent as a missionary to Sopara near Mumbai. About these Dharma emissaries, for example, Rock Edict number 13 says that they have been sent, and I'm quoting, where the Greek king Antiochus rules, beyond there where the 4 kings, Ptolemy, Antigonus, Magas and Alexander, rule, here in the king's domain, among the Greeks, the Kambodjas, everywhere people are following, beloved of the gods, instructions in the Dharma. Beloved of the gods, obviously being Ashoka. So these kings have been identified as Antiochus II, who ruled over the Seleucid Empire, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, with whom Antiochus warred, and who had become king of Egypt in 283 before the Common Era, Magas, his half-brother, who broke away and founded Cyrene in around 277 before the Common Era, Antigonus II Gonatas of Macedonia, and Alexander II of Epirus, which is approximately modern Albania. So in that list of kings that Ashoka sent Dharma emissaries to, an interesting thing to notice is that 2 of them, Antigonus II of Macedonia and Ptolemy II of Cyrene, were both friends with Timon, the main student of Pyrrho. Diogenes mentions that Timon had a penchant for debauchery, and that's why he was known to these 2 kings. From this period, we also have accounts of philosophers being sent for. So, for example, the king called in Greek Amitrokrates, which is probably in Sanskrit Amitragata, which was a name of the king Bindusara. This king wrote to Antiochus I, send me sweet wine, dried figs, and a philosopher. This is according to the work Deipnosophistae by Athenaeus of Naucratis, who was a rhetorician and a contemporary of Sextus and Nagarjuna. That same text also refers to exchanges of gifts between Chandragupta Maurya and Seleucus the Greek, whose daughter he married. in this period, we know that various embassies were sent. So Seleucus sent Megasthenes to Chandragupta Maurya, and we have quite an extensive account by Megasthenes of the Shramanas and Brahmanas that he met or knew about in India while he was at the court of Chandragupta. And this new work by Christopher Beckwith, Greek Buddha, examines Megasthenes' descriptions of the different kinds of wise person and sage, and tries to match it to what we know about the various Buddhist and non-Buddhist schools. Megasthenes wasn't the only ambassador. There was also the ambassador Damakos, who was sent to Bindusara, Chandragupta's son. And then in Pliny the Elder it's mentioned that Ptolemy II sent Dionysius as an ambassador to the Marians, which given the time period probably meant Ashoka. There are also accounts in the Greek texts about Shramanas travelling to Greece or to intermediate countries. So, for example, in Strabo, we have an account of one Shramana travelling to Athens, where he immolates himself in Athens while hymns are recited, which probably implies that he was a Brahmana. Probably most importantly of all, we have texts that record dialectical exchange between Indians and Greeks, and in particular, of course, the questions of Milinda or Menander, the Greek king. Menander was a successor of Demetrius, another Greek king interested in Buddhism that I'm going to talk about in a minute. Menander ruled over Haryana, which is now the region around Kabul in Afghanistan, Hazara and the Swat Valley, and Gandhara, including Taxila, from about 150 to 110 before the Common Era. He might also have ruled in Mathura. There are two texts in the Buddhist tradition talking about him: the debate of Menander, the Milinda Panha of the Theravada, included in the Burmese Pali Canon, and the Chinese discourse of the almsman Nagasena, Nagasena Bhikshu Sutra. Both of these recount a debate between Menander and Nagasena, who's a monk, and they use it to present a kind of catechism of Buddhist doctrine of their own schools. The Milinda Panha says that the debate happened in Sagala, which is 85 miles from Kashmir, about the same distance from Taxila. And the text's a dialogue between the king, who has many tricky problems with issues in the Buddhist teachings, and the mysterious Nagasena, who gives such flooring replies that the king, along with his retinue, ultimately accepts the Buddhist doctrines. As Bronkhorst has said recently, the very existence of this text is a testimony that the Greeks discussed religious and related questions with the Indians. And he discusses how it appears to be related to the first appearance of dialectic in certain Buddhist schools in the northwest. And this, just to give you an idea of how much of a language barrier there might have been, this is a photograph of the Rock Edict 13 in its recension at Kandahar, and you can see it's bilingual Greek and Aramaic. The fact that Ashoka was producing these edicts in so many different languages is strong evidence obviously that at least knowledge of these languages was quite common in Ashoka's time. The time of Pyrrho obviously is slightly earlier, but nevertheless, given the bilingual community's existences and the use of Aramaic, it seems almost impossible to support the idea that there was a language barrier. Incidentally, the Greek on this rock edict, my Greek isn't sophisticated enough to be able to judge, but apparently the Greek is sophisticated Greek. It's not crude, and incidentally it has in it the Greek translation of the word dharma in Sanskrit, and it was translated by the Greek word eusebia. So finally, turning to the time of Nagarjuna, interestingly, Taranatha, when he's talking about the first appearance of the Mahayana in the world, he says that after the reign of Mahapadma, Manjushri, in the form of a monk, brought the first Mahayana text into our human world and presented it to the king, who could be Chandragupta. The problem is here that although the king before Chandragupta was indeed called Mahapadma, it's not usually, Chandragupta's not usually translated into Tibetan like this. Nevertheless, both words mean protector of the moon. The first text that was brought, incidentally, by Manjushri was the 8,000 verse Perfection of Wisdom. So that was before Nagarjuna. Then we have the famous myth of Nagarjuna's learning the Perfection of Wisdom sutras from the Nagas. This story occurs principally in Tibetan texts, so Taranatha has two different versions of it, an earlier version which is more tantric in style, and a later version. The interesting thing here is that the Naga in question, according to Taranatha, or according to Taranatha's sources, which are actually quite early, is Taxika. Now, Taxika was the reason that Taxila was named Taxila. Taxila was the Greek mispronunciation of Taxika Shila. The place is called Taxika Shila probably because of the fact that there was a war in ancient India. Actually, the opening of the Mahabharata is talking about a genocide of Nagas and the exile of the Naga king Taxika to this area, the northwest. Taxila was also subsequently very important in the spread of the Mahayana. Again, Taranatha says that in the period subsequent to the Third Buddhist Council, there was a householder named Jati, which means twisted hair, who came from Taxila, or Asma Paranto as it's sometimes called in the Buddhist texts. And then Jati invited various masters, including one from Belch, to teach there and support 300,000 monks for 12 years. This is the first part of Taranatha's account of the extensive spread of the Mahayana. So Taxila was very important in the subsequent spread of the Mahayana, which possibly is suggestive. Various scholars have argued that the Mahayana includes origins in the northwest borderlands and in Central Asia. That's not to say that the entirety of the Mahayana was adopted wholesale from these areas, but there does seem to be evidence that certain Mahayana doctrines originated in those areas. Sylvain Lévy argued for a Tokharian origin for Manjushri. Charles Eliot argued for a Persian, actually Zoroastrian origin for Amitabha, and possibly also Kshitigarbha. Etienne Lamotte argued for a northwest Indian and Central Asian origin for some important Mahayana texts, and then more recently Xinru Liu, on the basis of the traded luxury items mentioned in the Mahayana Sutras and some Mahayana Sutras, has argued that at least part of the composition must have been done of those sutras in the corridor from Central Asia through Afghanistan or Kashmir to Taxila and then Nasik and Barigaza. So more recently, Walser, in his 2005 study, which is astonishingly good, consolidates all this with some textual evidence, some inscriptions, and some pilgrims' accounts and doxographies. And it does seem quite convincing that there certainly were strands of Mahayana which originated in these areas. Walser's study is mainly about how Mahayana doctrines were introduced, in particular by Nagarjuna. And the thing which comes across most strongly in his study is that the legal restrictions on textual transmission at that time in that area were so severe that there really wasn't much leeway in terms of changing words. So what one had to do was reinterpret terms, and that is what he argues Nagarjuna does. So, for example, taking the word most famously shunyata, emptiness, which had in the Hinayana schools referred principally to a kind of psychological process of emptying the mind of afflictive processes, reinterpreting that to be a process of contemplation of all reality, and the results of that contemplation, as we know, the Mahayana doctrine of lack of swabhava, or recognizing that the essence in phenomena which is somehow implied by language, by terms in language, that essence is a misconstrual of reality. That essence, in fact, isn't there. If that's the case, if there really was that degree of restriction on terms that could be used, we can see that foreign influences would have to be disguised. One thing which one can discover quite quickly looking at the texts that refer to this period is that Greek Buddhists were disguised by mythical classifications. So, for example, I mentioned earlier the Greek king Demetrius, the predecessor of Menander or Melinda. Demetrius was in favour of Buddhism, and he fought against Pushyamitra, an anti-Buddhist king. This story is told in various different places in Indian literature. So, for example, it's mentioned in Patanjali's Mahabhasya that he was the invader of Saketa, and strangely a place called Madhyamaka. In Kalidasa's Malavikagnimitram, Pushyamitra's nemesis is referred to just as a Greek, but in the Mahabharata it names him as Dattamitri, which is probably just a mispronunciation of Demetrius. The interesting thing is that there are two Buddhist texts who talk about this story of the nemesis of the anti-Buddhist king Pushyamitra. The two texts that mention the story are the Divyavadana and the Ashokavadana. Both of them call him Kermisha rather than Demetrius, and they both describe him as a yaksha, one of these mythological beings from Indian lore. In the Ashokavadana, it says that Kermisha, the yaksha, is encouraged to fight Pushyamitra by another yaksha called Damstranivasin, who offers him his daughter in marriage to this end, which seems like a faint echo of the story from the Greek side. So that, I think, should raise our awareness of the fact that when a text talks about a yaksha, it's not necessarily talking about a mythological being, a supernatural being. These words were used freely at this time to describe humans. Why is an interesting question, possibly because they referred to identified ethnic groups. I think it's something which promises to be quite a rewarding field of study. Taranatha, actually, in a supplement to his history, mentions that he has a kind of consideration of the history of Buddhist art, paintings and sculptures, and he says that at the time of before Ashoka, then it was devas who were the artists, and then at Ashoka's time it was yakshas who were the artists, and then in the time of Nagarjuna it was nagas who were the artists. So that seems quite clearly to me to be referring to particular groups of people. So devas, yakshas and nagas in this case is not talking about supernatural beings. It's possibly talking about ethnic groups, possibly talking about groups of people who claim inspiration from supernatural beings of various kinds. Obviously, also we know that in the time of Nagarjuna, the kind of Buddhist art which was becoming popular is the famously Greek-influenced sculpture. We can even guess why it might be that the Nagas might be chosen to represent Greeks or Bactrian Greeks in the texts. The histories of Alexander's travels in this area, the thing which strikes you most about them is how much they depended on the rivers and waterways. They travelled by ships. That probably struck the Indians, every couple of pages in the histories, the Greeks stop to make offerings to Poseidon, and we also have coins, Greek coins from this period where Poseidon was on the reverse. Poseidon obviously being the god of the ocean. We know about the traditional myths of the Nagas in Indian culture, that they were beings that inhabited waterways. They were also associated with wealth in a way that the Greeks clearly were, because they were collecting it. I think there's a good case to be made for arguing that the Indians would probably refer to these Greeks as Nagas. On a slightly wilder note, it's interesting to notice that in the Mahayana canon there are a group of sutras that are supposed to have been requested by Naga kings. One of them, one of these kings is called Sagara, which in Sanskrit obviously means ocean. Sagara Nagaraja, there are 3 sutras requested by him in the Tibetan canon. Interestingly, the shortest one is a presentation of what's now called the 4 seals of the Buddha Dharma, the way to recognize an authentic Buddhist teaching. The intermediate length sutra requested by Sagara Nagaraj is unusually a detailed definition of some basic Mahayana doctrines, as though it was an early Mahayana work. Most Mahayana sutras, or the more famous Mahayana sutras, refer to doctrines like the 10 virtues and the 10 non-virtues and the paramitas and so on, as if you're already supposed to know about them. This text unusually actually presents the definitions of them in quite a lot of detail. So they're the sutras requested by Sagara Nagaraja. There are other sutras requested by Taksika Nagaraja. So one possibility is that these actually referred to particular Greeks. So perhaps Sagara Nagaraja is actually the Nagaraja, or the king of the Nagas, at Sagara, or possibly Sagala. Remember, we were looking at the Menanda or the Milinda questions, which is supposed to have been taught in Sagala. This one of the main examples of the dialectical exchange between the Indians and the Greeks. So Sagara could be Sagala. Taksika Nagaraja, of course, could be the king of the Nagas at Taxila, which could be Agathocles, who is a Greek ruler in Taxila in the period after Alexander. Possibly it could even refer to Alexander himself. I think it would be a very fruitful project to look into the names of the supposedly mythical beings mentioned in the Mahayana Sutras, and look for this disguising activity going on. Possibly we might be able to connect these supernatural beings with actual known historical characters. So, finally, all of this connectedness, even the idea of transmissions one way or another, ultimately maybe isn't that interesting. What is interesting, I think, is that we have two different projects that do seem to be very similar, that each now have a lot of scholarly interest in them, and nevertheless the two scholarly communities working on the two projects don't really communicate very much. So you see a lot of the same misunderstandings develop in the two different areas of study. One very illuminating thing to do would be to bring the insights gained by one scholarly community to bear on the problems being dealt with by the other. And there are, I don't have time to go into it now, but there are a lot of examples of how, for example, a study of Madhyamaka can really illuminate difficulties in the understanding of Pyrrhonism and vice versa. So effectively what we're doing here is taking one project and applying it to the other and seeing what happens. And actually this is very much in the spirit of both projects. Both of these projects, as we've alluded to before, have this idea of the two levels of truth, and both of them undermine quite spectacularly and thoroughly the criteria for truth, and they undermine any way that we feel we have of accessing a kind of final pronouncement about the way things actually are in reality. What they don't undermine in either case, and they both explicitly say that they don't undermine this, is the criteria for accomplishing practical aims, what the Madhyamikas would call the conventional truth. The conventional truth has to be relied on, really, first of all, to eat. As we saw in the Bhava Viveka quote, conventional truth is what's relied on in order to attain the insight of the ultimate truth. That insight consisting principally of the fact that they're recognizing the conventional as conventional, rather than mistaking the conventional to be the ultimate. So, although they talk about these two criteria in different ways, they do seem to be stressing the same point, which is that although concepts can be deployed to gain our aims, to successfully accomplish our aims, that doesn't mean that those concepts actually have reference in reality. That's quite a radical thing to say. It's very similar, I think, to what's now called the scientific method, as it was framed by Popper. Popper described science famously as falsifying hypotheses. So in science, what we do is prove what doesn't work. Temporarily, therefore, there are things which seem to work, but nevertheless the project of science is to dismiss, to falsify hypotheses, and that's how scientific progress takes place. The difficulties in reconciling that with our ordinary human tendency to want to believe things quickly became clear also in Popper, obviously. Popper, in later editions of his work, tried to argue that somehow science does progress towards truth, but his arguments are very difficult to sustain, and this is directly related to the two criteria in Sextus, to the two levels of truth in Madhyamaka, that the practical criterion is very different to a criterion for truth. And that goes back to the original comment that I referred to at the beginning of this talk, where someone quipped that in the end the speaker in this talk would have to suspend judgment about whether or not Madhyamaka and Pyrrhonism are the same. Although that's true, we can apply them crosswise and find out, discover whether we can successfully achieve our aims in the study of these two areas, and I think that we can.